You might have heard of HBO's series The Gilded Age. It's 1882 in New York City, and a young woman is thrown into a world full of beautiful dresses and balls and tea parties, all set against the backdrop of Manhattan's Upper East Side. Also in 1882, 4 miles away in another part of Manhattan, a young woman named Carolina has also been thrown into a new world. But her dress is cotton, not silk. She has no luxurious flowers for her hat. Her days are spent in factory work, not tea parties and balls. Both these young women were finding their way in new, unfamiliar places, but only one of them is real. Who was Carolina? My great-great-grandmother. Welcome to The Clothes on Their Backs. My name is V. I study the history of clothing and fashion. Not just the design, but what clothes can tell us about people and societies. I recreate old clothes to learn about the work that went into them and what it feels like to wear them. Clothing is really personal and human, and at the same time very public because it's so visible to the rest of the world. It's about what a dress meant to the person wearing it. Did it make her feel beautiful, comfortable, outdated, or shabby? And about what it meant to the rest of the world seeing it. Throughout history, people have dressed differently for reasons as big as where in the world they were from or how much money they had, to simple little reasons like their favorite color or their plans for the day. We still do. And when you look at that meaning, suddenly fashion history is not just about pretty dresses. It's interwoven with everything else: trade, economics, class, nationality and immigration, culture. Clothing tells us about a time and place because it told the people wearing it and the people seeing it about who they were and what part they played in the world around them. The Gilded Age is full of beautiful, glamorous silk dresses for every occasion. And while it is a TV show with costumes rather than real antique dresses, I find it really interesting because historical fiction, shows and movies like this, are us today telling ourselves a story about history. You look at it that way, suddenly it's not just about the people back then. It tells us about modern day society and culture too. What kind of clothes do we want to reproduce and make costumes out of and look at on screen? What kind of stories do we tell ourselves about the past? But that's true in history as well as historical fiction or TV shows. History is what we retell and pass down and remember. It's the story we tell about what the past was like. There's the parts of history we dream about and make shows and movies about. The pretty dresses, the beautiful houses, the fancy balls and dinner parties. We like to identify with the characters, see ourselves in them and their lives. Some of us even make costumes so we can dress up like them. We like to imagine ourselves in this part of history. And then there's the parts of history we don't want to think about because they're not pretty or glamorous or fun. Maybe we talk about them, but impersonally, with distance. We retell them selectively, focusing on the parts that are easier and less frightening. Sometimes we gloss over them entirely, or forcibly rewrite the story because it doesn't make us look very good, or it doesn't look very good for us. Sure, the pretty dresses and balls all happened, but how many real people's stories are we choosing to leave untold? When we imagine ourselves in history, are we thinking about who we, ourselves, with all of our background would be? Or are we thinking of someone else? Someone who has a better life than we do? Someone who isn't restricted in the ways a person of our background might have been? Or are we thinking of our ancestors? The people who really did experience history the way we would because they are where we came from. My great-great-grandmother Carolina and I have a lot in common. She was a Jewish woman of Eastern European ancestry, and so am I. She had a brother several years younger, so do I. And just like me, she moved away from everything she'd ever known at 19 years old. But where I crossed a country in a day, she crossed an ocean and several more countries in a journey that probably took weeks. Great-great-grandma Carolina might have lived in New York City at the same time as the Gilded Age, but she was not walking around in dresses like this. Her clothes didn't have this sort of glamour, and neither did her life. My ancestors, my people, who I would have been if I lived back then, do not really make it into this version of history. And that changes how you can watch a show like this. Knowing the world around you finds your ancestor's story, what would be your story, too uninteresting or challenging or upsetting to see on TV, or even to teach accurately. What is it like to know that your family's lives are one of those parts of history that we gloss over or forget or rewrite? I think the Jewish folks watching will already understand what I'm talking about, but because of this erasure, this lack of context, it can be tricky to put yourself in the shoes of someone from another background when you don't know that much about their culture or where they come from. This video is sponsored by Wondrium, an educational streaming service that offers everything from short-form video to documentaries, tutorials, and full-length lecture series that let you learn from the experts themselves. They update their library monthly, so there's always something new to check out, and you can enjoy Wondrium from just about anywhere. For me, that often means while sewing, but maybe for you, that's on your phone on the bus. If you want some background for why diving into my Jewish ancestry means so much to me, I'd suggest checking out their Great World Religions Judaism course. It's a great primer for non-Jews who want to understand our culture better, but I found it fascinating even with a Jewish background. I was aware that around 2,000 years ago, the students of sages like Hillel had some pretty epic arguments with other Jewish scholarly groups, but I did not know that apparently the schools of Hillel and another sage called Shammai had a tendency to argue so intensely over religious law they got into fisticuffs. Not the sort of thing one expects to come across in religious scholarship, but I think it's really cool that the messy yet human aspects are maintained in Jewish religious history. If I've made you wonder about anything so far, and I really hope I have, you're going to love Wondrium. They're offering my viewers a free trial, so please visit wondrium.com/SnappyDragon to support the channel, or click the link in the description to start your free trial today. Great-great-grandma Carolina, and the rest of my ancestors, are Ashkenazi Jews. They lived in Romania, the Russian Empire, and Hungary, where Carolina came here from. There was this huge wave of Ashkenazi Jews immigrating from Eastern Europe starting in the 1880s. My mother's side came over later in that wave, between 1904 and 1920. Carolina, on my dad's side, came over right in 1880, so at the very beginning of that wave. America has this popular mythos about Ashkenazi Jews immigrating. These poor immigrants fleeing violence and poverty with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty. The proverbial golden door, arriving someplace their children could prosper. As a country, we paint this as a success story. Pat ourselves on the back for being a nation of immigrants. A place where people like my ancestors could come to live better lives. A lot of this is the truth, but it's a very selective truth. We tell certain success stories, people who did very well for themselves. We tell the rest in statistics, which are great for reducing people into data. When someone is just a number, it's hard to relate to them or think of them as a person just like you, who gets up in the morning and gets dressed and eats breakfast and goes to work. And we don't talk about the ugly or ironic parts if we can help it. With the state of things in Eastern Europe at the time, Carolina and her family were likely fleeing the early phases of genocide. Mob violence, economic discrimination, anti-Semitic laws, military conscription. But the America that existed for them to immigrate to is not free of atrocities. It's built on land theft and genocide against the indigenous peoples of this continent, and on the labor of generations of kidnapped and enslaved and trafficked Africans who were forced to build the foundations of the American nation. This is not a pleasant story, but that doesn't make it any less true. Likewise, while Jews coming from America might have been free from the threat of pogroms and much of Eastern Europe's anti-Semitism, they still faced plenty of discrimination and poverty and struggle. There's a nuance and complexity to the truth that things were better and safer, and also difficult and unfamiliar. I don't want this sort of selective, impersonal story to be the only version of my ancestor's life that anyone remembers. I want to know what it was like for her stepping off the ship for the first time, where she lived, where she worked, how she felt about her life in America. She's not here to tell me any of that, but I think fashion history can. It would be a dream for me to look at Carolina's actual dresses, but we don't have anything of hers left. It's actually tricky for a lot of reasons. Carolina was working class, and working class clothes tended to get worn until they fell apart rather than saved. Carolina was one more Jewish girl living in the Lower East Side at a time when the neighborhood was seen as something of a slum. So the prevailing record keepers of her time, the winners who write history, would not have considered her life worthy of documenting on a personal level. For a lot of people, you can talk to your family members, and if you have grandparents or other ancestors you can ask to tell their stories, you absolutely should. The parts of history that we don't take an interest in, that we don't document, are the parts that are gone when our ancestors are. These are the things that get forgotten. And I wish I could do this because there's so much about Carolina as a person I can't learn from historical record or even dress recreation. But talking to my family is not an option for me. Carolina is my father's ancestor, and unfortunately, I'm not able to have a relationship with that side of my family. It just isn't a possibility, isn't safe. And it's difficult to reconcile taking an interest in your family history when your experience of that family has been really traumatic. If you don't have the usual ways of connecting to something like family, it starts to seem impossible. And for a long time, I felt the same way about being Jewish. I'm not really religious in that sense. I don't believe or really disbelieve in God. It's Jewish culture and community and history that matters to me. But when I started studying history, even the history of clothing, I was able to find my way to a Jewish identity that's right for who I am. I can't connect to my family history through my immediate family, but I refuse to let that trauma cut me off from where I came from. Often, fashion historians will look at a piece of clothing and use it to learn about the person who wore it or the person who made it. I'm going to do the reverse. I am going to look at great-great-grandma Carolina's life, as much about it as I can figure out, and use it to recreate an outfit she might have made for herself. It's not just a sewing project. If I want to do this right, I have to dive into her world and learn along the way. The only solid record I have of her journey to the US is from November of 1880, when she gets on a boat from Hamburg to England with her younger brother, and says her final destination is America. We know she made it there by the end of the year because census records tell us that was when she immigrated. I'm imagining what it would be like for her at 18 or 19 in an unfamiliar country, in a neighborhood like the Lower East Side that had a strong American identity, even though it was an immigrant community. It might be the next spring before she could save up enough money for any new clothes. And I'd like to think she'd want something nice for herself, even if she didn't have much to spare. So what would a young Jewish immigrant girl's new best dress, her Shabbat dress, look like in the spring of 1881? What would it be like for her to make that dress? What would the fabric cost her compared to the wages of factory work? How many hours would she spend sewing? How many stitches? How would she feel when she finally put it on? That is what I want to know. So I'm going to do my best to make this dress for her, to connect with my family history and my people's history in a way that honors who I am, as well as who they are. Over the next 5 weeks, you'll see me design and sew this dress using all the historical information I can lay my hands on, and then take it with me to New York City to explore the same streets my great-great-grandmother walked 150 years ago. Great-great-grandma Carolina's story is my story, in a way. It's the story of where I come from. It's the story I have to share. There are so many other stories that slip through the cracks that are not mine to tell, but need to be told all the same. That is where you come in. I want to hear the untold stories of your family history, and I want the world to hear them too. Talk to your grandparents and relatives, or take a closer look at a family heirloom. Then post your story to Facebook or Instagram with the hashtag Threads of Our Ancestors. I'll be resharing as many as I can on social media. I've also just launched a new section of my website just for your stories. So go check out snappydragonstudios.com/threads of our ancestors and see all of the, threads of history that folks are contributing. If social media is not your thing, you can also email submissions with a photo and caption to threadsofourancestors@gmail.com. And if nothing else, say hello in the comments and tell us where you come from. Next week, I'll dive into the design process for Carolina's dress, making patterns, choosing fabrics, and all the decisions that have to be made before I can sew anything. Tune back in at 9 a.m. Pacific time next Wednesday and subscribe to the channel to make sure you catch every episode. You can also check out my Patreon to support my work and get exclusive bonus content too. I'll see you next week. Bye!